Welcome everyone to the Next Wave and CMS Masterclass on building a responsible and compliant AI-powered organization. At today's session, we're planning to share some viewpoints, frameworks, and examples of the things that firms should be paying attention to in building a responsible AI-powered business. So we're going to be talking about topics that include responsible and ethical AI use cases, bias, explainability, personalization, the regulatory landscape, and how to engage with regulators, and also AI governance and assurance and AI sustainability. So a lot to cover. However, before we get into all of this, let's do some introductions. I'm Tony Clark, founder and CEO at NextWave. NextWave is a practitioner-led consultancy. We're working with financial institutions across the sector on their strategic business transformation initiatives, many of which are based on AI and automation solutions. We framed this as a masterclass session, and that's really on the strength of the panel here. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two deep experts in the AI governance and ethics space. So firstly, Dr. Paul Dongha, who is the head of responsible AI and AI strategy at NatWest Group. Paul was until recently group head of data and AI ethics at Lloyds Bank, and he's also advised the UK government on AI policy and taught AI at Harvard Business School. And welcome also to Rob Dedman, who's a partner at CMS Law. Rob is an ex-regulator. He's worked at the FCA as PRA supervisor and at the Bank of England, where he set up the Regulatory Action Division. At CMS, Rob specialises in advising on AI regulation for major corporates, amongst many other things, including sitting as a judge when he can make time. So perhaps let's just start with a quick intro from each of you. In your own words, your focus areas and what you hope to share today within the responsible AI space. So should we go to Paul first, please?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tony, and lovely to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. So, as Tony said, I work at NatWest Banking Group, and I'm head of responsible AI and the bank's AI strategy. So really what that means is when it comes to technology, process, people, everything needed to ensure that guardrails are put in the software development and model development life cycle, as well as once AI models are deployed, that those guardrails are robust, fit for purpose, and that the bank is organized and structured in a way that it mitigates ethical risks and risks of AI going out of control. And I'm really glad that actually the second part of my role, which is running the bank's AI strategy, we can use responsible AI as the foundation of the bank's long-term strategy for using AI.
Thanks, Paul. So guide rails and responsible AI, I think as we'll get into it, we'll realize as important now as ever. And Rob, welcome. So perhaps a few words from you.
Thanks, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see everyone. And so my take on all of this is very much from sort of regulators' perspective. As Tony said, I was a regulator for a number of years. And one of the things that we're particularly interested in from a CMS perspective is how to deploy AI in a way that the regulators understand and can engage with, and that take account of the risks that they're seeking to mitigate through the exercise of their functions. And that's certainly where we're doing a lot of work at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. And for our part in this space, NextWave is working with some clients on AI-powered solutions. We've also run a recent series of AI breakfast forums on AI adoption and AI journey with a group of senior peers from a range of firms across sell side and buy side across financial services. And we've had quite a diverse group of participants. And one thing is very clear is that folks are at different stages on their journey. And we've had engineering groups at one end of the table and business representatives at the other from the same firm, and huge diversity in status and progress. I think from the engineering group in a recent session that we ran, they were really on the front foot. They developed a lot of models. They've done a lot of data science work, and they felt that they were ready from the engineering perspective. And their business counterparts were still really coming up the education curve and trying to work out which use cases were applicable for AI. And we see that right across the sector. The other takeaway for us from our interactions with our clients and the wider market has been that AI is clearly here to stay as a co-intelligence or a co-pilot in almost everything that we're doing. And as the audience may know, there have been several research studies on this, one of which determined that only 36 out of 1,016 job types had no overlap and were unlikely to be touched by AI. And a separate research group led by Stanford University discovered that BCG consultants work faster and more creatively if they include AI, which I think is true for all of us. For more on that topic, not really for this webinar and many more, there is, and I'll get my book recommendation in quickly, Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick, super practical read on the impact of AI and how we're all going to have to adjust to working with AI. So anyway, we thought we would start with a little bit of context and framework for AI use cases and the AI journey, just to baseline this conversation, and then we're going to jump into the various responsible and compliance topics to follow. So this is a simple use case framework. I imagine every firm represented in the audience today has something like this. And what this is doing is really drawing out the distinction between narrow and generative AI across a variety of use cases across a typical firm. And narrow being a specific task AI. So machine learning models, I mean, the best analogy that I prefer is like a chess computer. It's been trained to do something in particular. And generative AI being capable of using an underlying model, the large language models that we've all heard about and are using, and sometimes small language models, and lots of training data to generate text, images, code, etc. And the narrow machine learning use cases have been around in the industry for quite some time, powering chatbots and maybe some customer service and some analytics applications. But with the advent of generative AI, the number of potential use cases has just grown exponentially, and there are hundreds of them. So we're not going to drain through all of those. But if you look across the business front to back, we're talking about fraud detection, we're talking about automating customer operations, we're talking about augmenting and enhancing the advisory process in the front office. And there are many things that across the sector are now being worked on, both at a POC stage and also now in deployment, whether that's, underwriting for lending operations or for insurance, or customer complaints handling, the advisory journey in the wealth sector, and I could go on. So purpose of today's session isn't to unpack all of this, but just to acknowledge that this is being worked out all the way across the sector. And really, it's a combination of this narrow AI and the generative capabilities that is really amplifying the opportunity. And what we're seeing now as well is, and everyone's talking about it, is the addition of automation or agency, so agentic AI. And 2025 is going to be the year of agentic AI. And those who are following the sector will have seen that recent announcements from Anthropic. Claude can now operate a computer. So the need for guide rails and standards and regulation has never been more acute than it is currently. Second thing I wanted to share was a maturity model, because back to that point from the AI forums that we've been facilitating with our client base, folks are all at different stages. And so we found this very useful really for firms, for individuals to benchmark and to identify where they are on the journey. It helps partly in understanding the journey map, but also in understanding the various layers or dimensions of building out your AI and governing your AI and making your AI compliant. So it serves really for two purposes. And there are firms all across the sector are either at the left-hand side or the right-hand side of this. And for those of you who are listening and watching and thinking, crikey, there's a lot of slideware here, consultants can really move without a few slides. But I think these frameworks, and there's a few more to follow as we get into the particular topics, are very useful to really unpack each of the areas that we're going to be talking about. And we will share the deck with everyone who registered after the session. So I'm not even going to attempt to sort of drain through some of the details here, but they're quite nice takeaways. I hope those of you who get them at the end of the session will agree. So just coming back onto topic, what are we going to talk about? So really in three parts. So we'll start with AI use cases, responsible and ethical AI use cases. So really, what are the use cases? What are the risks? What does a responsible use case look like? What does an irresponsible use case look like? Talk a bit about bias and explainability. So that's really theme one. The second part of this session today is going to be about the regulatory landscape. So really unpacking the regulatory must-dos and how to engage and work with the regulators. And then the third part is around AI sustainability, which might be a newish topic to some. I think there's a really interesting conversation around what does sustainable AI mean and how does it line up alongside responsible AI. As we do that, the use case and the roadmap frameworks I think are quite useful, because for me it's not just the stages 1 to 5 and where are you on your journey, it's those layers that I mentioned. So we can't just think about the use cases or just think about the models. We have to think about the data and the technology, we have to think about the skill sets, and we have to think about governance and controls as well. So for all of you who are sort of trying to understand where you are on this journey and what your priorities are, I think it may be helpful to think about the layers in this framework in order to sort of put a pin in the map. Okay, so enough from me. We wanted to hear a bit more from our panel. So just to open this up, let's start with use cases in financial services. And I'm going to throw this over to Paul. If you could put your spin on, the use of AI in the sector, and then we'll talk a little bit about, what can go well, what can go wrong, and where the ethical boundaries are.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tony. And hopefully you can hear me okay. If not, please do let me know. I wanted to just tease out, I think, some of the eminent use cases that we're seeing at the moment across the industry. And this just isn't just in banking and financial services. It is across most organizations. So let me go through them in order. The first use case, chatbot performance and accuracy improvements. Well, we're all used to seeing chatbots on websites being quite clunky and not being able to recognize intent quite quickly, trying to put you through to someone that you can speak to. Well, since the launch of ChatGPT, with its famous new transformer architecture, which is the underlying mechanics of how it works, we've just noticed something amazing, that you're able to have far more conversant conversations, just as you would with a human being. And the chatbot is able to infer intent and able to respond much more accurately. Now that's a huge step change, and so much so now that you, with the launch of ChatGPT, it's very hard to discern whether or not you're actually speaking to a real person or a machine. So that change in technology has really boosted the capability of chatbots. And what we're finding is, in some cases, it's not just recognizing intent and providing a better answer, but we're able to start thinking about putting workflows in. So it's not just using a chatbot to give you your balance or to find the document. You can actually do things like maybe look at pension options and maybe even go through and select a pension, or do some actual workflow, which normally you just would never imagine using a chatbot for. And I think, as Tony alluded to earlier, he talks about agents, and I think this craze around using agents is underpinned by the ability of these technologies to actually do far more than chatbots in the past. So that's kind of a standout case, and many companies are utilizing those, but they're not without the dangers, which I'll talk about later. The second one, call center service support interface, is quite a mouthful, but in effect, what it's saying is those organizations that have call centers, like banks, where customers sometimes have to call in to a complete transaction or they have a query about something, at the moment they call a call center operator, we now have the ability to surface summaries of that customer's previous interactions in a much more sophisticated way than we used to have. So with potentially the ability to recognize next best action or recommend next best action. So the call center operator's ability to have a really, really good constructive conversation with the customer has now been improved. So there's no kind of being on hold or call center operator saying, well, let me read the notes from your last call. In the moment, the AI can surface to the call center operator's screen while they're talking to a customer very pertinent, very relevant information that's really tailored towards customers. So we see that not only improving customer service and the customer's interaction, but also for people who are employed in call centers, because they can potentially have better conversations, more constructive conversations, rather than trying to figure things out or locate a piece of data. The third one we're seeing here, and this came out very early when ChatGPT was launched, improving relationship managers with analytics tied to personalized recommendations. So, as we know in financial services, there are individuals that will have a relationship manager. There are organizations that will have a banking relationship manager. So that's a personal relationship, but really that person is providing bespoke content and bespoke information. Generative AI can be very useful for surfacing the right information for relationship managers, allowing potentially more relationships for one relationship manager, quicker turnaround of notes and recommendations. And we're seeing that in a number of banks, actually. And the fourth one is hyper-personalization for better targeted campaigns. Now, we've seen predictive AI before ChatGPT and the transformer architecture being used for some of this, but what we're now seeing is that we can provide really bespoke interfaces. So, for example, imagine your app that you might have, it might be your Barclays app on your phone. At the moment, everyone's app looks exactly the same. My version of app that I use for banking looks the same as my mum's. There's probably no reason for that. When you think about it, it should be quite different because we have different banking needs. So I think what we're going to see is far more hyper-personalization across various sectors. So I'll pause there. There are others in sort of knowledge management, surfacing data with coding and lots of Copilot usage. But I think if we focus on customer service, I think these are where we're going to see, and we are seeing major impacts. Over to you, Tony.
Paul, do you want to, let's just roll this forward, and if you want to talk for a moment about the risks. So I think this is where we start to get into the real topic here, ethics and regulation.
Exactly. So I have two slides on this, I believe. This particular slide is with relevance to the risks from predictive AI. So predictive AI, some people call it machine learning, was all the stuff that happened before November 22, what we used to think of then as AI. And really, there are risks of bias, discrimination, and privacy violations. So let me talk about one example. The one right on the top left, Amazon scrapped sexist AI tool. It's quite a famous case, and I'm sure members of the audience have heard about this one. But what Amazon tried to do, I think back in 2016, they thought, wouldn't it be a good idea to create a CV screening application so we can improve how quickly we filter candidates for hiring? But of course, they trained their AI machine learning model on CVs of previous employees that are in the organization. And you know what? Hey presto, the actual app downranked CVs from females and upranked those from males. And the essence of the problem is in predictive AI, it will make recommendations that are similar to the data it's been trained on. And it sounds quite simple to eradicate, but it's actually quite a difficult issue to remove bias and discrimination. Even if you fix the training data, there is still issues within the way the training data is selected, the way it's combined, the way the model behaves. So it can creep in through a process called proxying. Some of you may have heard of that. So it's actually quite insidious, quite hard to remove the bias from within the algorithm. The one to the right of that, Google apologizes for its photo app again. That was a very famous one. When Google launched this, their Photos app would infer and categorize the pictures and made an awful blunder categorizing a woman of color. And that hit the headlines. So that was absolutely awful and really unforgivable. But again, the danger there is the algorithm has been trained on lots and lots of photos. And when it's trained on lots of photos, it's either in or it's out. It's either one thing or another. There's no gray areas. And in this particular case, it did categorize a lady of color as something awful, and they took that down. And I won't go through all of them. There are many. Move forward.
So, Paul, with the advent of Gen AI, so what happens to the risk surface as a result?
Well, the risk surface has actually increased. So there are some new risks. So, for example, people will have heard of hallucinations. That never used to happen in pre-transformers, right? Pre-ChatGPT. So what that is the ability for these models to make up content. And the reason they make up content is because actually when you ask ChatGPT a question and it responds with text, it's piecing together small parts of words, word segments, and it's piecing those together based on the training data it's seen before. So it can actually come up with something completely fictitious. It's not actually going to a database and looking up an answer and putting it on a screen. It's actually the way it works is it stitches these segments of words together. So that famous hallucination model, we never used to have that. That's insidious because it's actually the same technique that gives it that ability, also gives it its power to generalize really, really well. So we have to put guardrails. You can't take it out of the algorithm by design. Also, the generative AI architecture, when it comes to things like deep fakes, the underlying architecture is called a diffusion model, slightly different to a transformer model, but it's of the same ilk. It's producing amazingly sophisticated deepfake technology. I think on here is a famous example of came out a few months ago. An employee of a corporation was duped into sending a wire transfer of millions of dollars to what he or she believed was another office that was instructed on Teams call by the chief financial officer. It wasn't. It was a deep fake of the CFO on a call with an employee asking him to authorize a transfer. And that's just one example of the kind of problems we can get into. And right on the top right, there's an even famous one, probably the first one to hit the press, I think, of April 23. Samsung engineer put some code into ChatGPT, and really ChatGPT was then able to use that code and reveal it to someone else outside of the organization. So the threat of having your intellectual property leaked through these public transformer models is there. Right, again, guardrails have to be put in to prevent that kind of thing from happening.
Yeah, and the tools to produce these things are right out there in the open now. So on the deep fake side, anyone who's experimented with Synthesia's avatars or 11 Labs voice generation, and we've used both actually. If you go on the Next Wave website, there are some synths that introduce some of the content that we have up on the resource hub, and it's quite a nice tool for that. It's good for training and things like that. But it's very, very easy to build these sort of digital humans, and they are super lifelike. So if we just sort of bring it up a level and sort of look across the ethical and safety risks that we're seeing here, and I'd like to bring Rob in on this perhaps as well, the sort of things that CMS clients are surfacing and looking for advice on that are, really starting to rear their head.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And you can see on the slide there the various different ethical and safety risks that come up. I think if you're a regulator, you're particularly concerned with things like biased outputs and toxicity, for example. And actually, there's a recent set of statistics that were produced by the FS regulators. So the FCA and the PRA had written out to regulated firms and asked them to sort of respond to a survey. And if you were looking at that from a regulatory perspective, the big worry there is there's a statistic that says 75% of firms are already using some form of AI in their business. And then further down the document, there's a statistic that says 46% of respondent firms reported only having a partial understanding of the AI technologies they use. And if you juxtapose those two things together and you break it then down into the regulators' objectives and what they're worried about, you think about all of that. You're looking at things like biased outputs and toxicity. Is from a consumer duty perspective, is the AI going to produce something which is actually harmful to consumers, notwithstanding that the firm may have gone into it with the best of intentions? And what is it that drives that? Is it a lack of understanding on the part of the firm? Is it the fact the firm's using a third-party provider and doesn't necessarily understand the models that the third-party provider are using? So there's also a tie into operational resilience and third-party risk management in all of that. And so what you sort of start to see is sort of bringing together lots of different, if I can put it this way, sort of regulatory priorities into one, sort of underpins a lot of this this AI-related sort of concern that you sometimes see the regulators have. And so I've just pulled out two there, biased outputs and third-party models. I mean, those are two that we see quite regularly coming up, where the regulators are like, look, actually, we just need to understand how is this governed? How does it work? How do you explain it? And how have you deployed it? And then how have you thought about it through the whole life cycle of the deployment of the thing, from first design principles all the way through to when it's actually running by itself. And actually, it might be worth Paul just coming in on that, because I know you've got a lot of experience of sort of deploying these things into the business, and you've been talking to regulators about that. Just interested in your take on that, because that's certainly what we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. I mean, look, it's a really active conversation because some of the guardrails to guard against those issues are being developed kind of in the moment. They're certainly by no means, I would say, established. So as a banking organisation, and all banks I'm aware of, they're building guardrails in-house. They're also working with technology firms like your Googles and your Microsofts, who are actively building guardrails around their models. So in partnership, we're helping each other to be able to mitigate against things like biased outputs and toxicity by trapping the response of an AI model, and then searching for patterns and keywords and all sorts of techniques to identify the exposure of biased or toxic language. Also, leaks of things that look like, for example, an account number or someone's name or a customer's name or an address, but something that really needs a human in the loop to look at it and say, well, it's come out of the model, should it have, and take the appropriate action. Some of that can be automated, but what a lot of my colleagues are doing is they're just saying, look, we're just going to stop the models out at that point as soon as we recognise that.
Yeah.
So it's really active, and there's this thing called prompt injection and jailbreaking, which sounds a bit dark, really, and mysterious. That's people writing prompts, which is the thing you write when you query ChatGPT. And there are people that write prompts designed to break the model or get the model to elicit a biased output. We have to guard against that, and that's particularly difficult. But again, security firms are all over.
I imagine looking at these. Sorry, Rob, I was going to come back to you because, as I know, CMS is one of the larger global law firms, and you're consulting with clients all across multi-sector and big firms and small firms. I know you foster a vibrant community of fintech startups and scale-ups, as well as working with some of the biggest firms on the planet. I look at this chart and I look at left-hand side and I say copyright infringement, hallucinations. Are your clients coming to CMS Law to say, what on earth do I do about this?
I mean, certainly from the financial services sector, the hallucinations piece is quite an important one, because if you think again about, particularly if you're moving towards an auto decisioning model, and I think that, when you look at the stats, there aren't that many firms using auto decisioning, fully autonomous decisioning. There's some elements of decision making in there somewhere in some respects, but for the most part, most firms haven't moved there yet. But obviously the importance of hallucinations increases, or avoiding hallucinations increases, the closer you get to fully autonomous decision making, because you've got to be able to rely on what the model is producing. The less human in the loop you've got, the more you've got to rely on the fact that it's producing a good and appropriate outcome. And I think we're going to come on to talk a little bit about the difference between fair outcomes and accuracy later on in this piece. But when you think about the consumer duty in particular, and what the consumer duty is aiming at, what we see a lot from clients is, look, how do we make sure that we embed that consumer duty thinking right from the beginning and all the way through the life cycle? And then how do we make sure we monitor it in real time to make sure that there aren't hallucinations coming up that are being missed and therefore leading to poor consumer outcomes? And then there's how do we measure that? And actually the measurement piece, because the consumer duty is as much about measurement and feedback loops as it is about the sort of input part of the matrix. There's real issues around how you measure what's being produced and how you then feed that back into the process to make sure that when the process is learning its way through, that it's doing the things that it ought to be doing. And those are all really, really difficult questions. I mean, they're difficult enough for large organizations like the one that Paul works for, I think, and I'm not talking specifically about NatWest in particular, but actually if you take a small firm or smaller firm, as you were saying, Tony, that's doing this not quite off the side of someone's desk, but has not got necessarily the sophistication and resources that are available to Paul and his team, it's a real challenge, I think.
Yeah, indeed. And it's quite a nice segue, that piece on consumer duty, into the wider regulatory landscape. So I think we'll move it forward. And the point on the right-hand side is actually called out on this page around energy use and environmental harm. We're going to come back to, because that's the sustainable AI topic. So sort of hold that thought, and we will get there. But EU AI Act, so quite a big topic, quite a leading topic from the EU regulators. Can we perhaps unpack this? I mean, for me, I think this one page is great, actually, because it says you don't do the things on the top left. If you are doing the things on the right-hand side, you've got to do the 9 things that are that are listed. And if you're using general purpose AI on the left, then here's 8 things that you need to do, and the applicable bits. It's kind of all there on one slide. But if we can perhaps bring this to life a little bit for financial institutions and what they should be thinking about, right now, and how do they plan into, in a sort of playbook sense. I mean, what do we need to be doing now to make sure that firms are lining up with this? I don't know who wants to go first on that one.
Shall I start, Paul, and hand over to you? I think I put it very briefly in 3 words: governance, governance, governance. When you look at all of these things, so look at the sort of bottom left and the bottom right, when you actually take it back, strip it back to its barest, what we're really saying here, and this is where the UK regulators are as well. Of course, this is for the EU. If you're outside the EU and you've got customers in the EU, you've still got to comply with it. It's extraterritorial. The UK doesn't have a similar framework. But actually, if you talk to the UK regulators, what they're saying is it's all about governance all the way through the process and making sure that you've got your governance right. And if you troll down some of the things in the 2 bottom boxes there and you take them up a level, and Paul, I'm sure we'll be able to talk to the lower level stuff, but sort of further down into the detail. But if you take it up a level, you're absolutely looking at this question of governance has got to be well designed and well implemented. And then translate that into a senior manager's regime context. Somebody's got to be responsible. And that's where I think some of this is really important, that you get this right from the very beginning.
Absolutely. I think just to add to the comments that Rob made, the EU AI Act is now law. Right? It came in the first week of August, so it's in law. As Rob said, just because we're not in the EU, in the UK, doesn't mean that we can bypass this. If any a UK entity that deploys an AI system for users that are based in the European Union, or you fall under the remit of this legislation, hence it's territorial. And it is quite prohibitive. So you see on the top left, there are, and I just pulled out five categories of use of AI. It's just illegal. So if anyone's building a system that is there to either deceive people or be manipulative or to do facial recognition, that's just not allowed, right? So facial recognition is different to biometric categorization. So if you deploy a system that scans people's faces to let them into a building, into their employer's office, that's fine, because you're identifying them through there. But if you're scanning images from CCTV from the street and trying to identify people and do something, those kind of things are just illegal. So I think the EU AI Act takes fundamental rights really seriously. So the rights of the society to flourish, human agency, these are really core to what's produced the EU AI Act. And on the right, the high-risk AI systems. Well, if you're building an AI system that does any of the 8 things listed in the box on the top right, they're classified as high risk, which means that in effect, the regulators say, if you get anything wrong in these systems, there is an impact to people. And if there's an impact to people, that's really important to us. So the box on the bottom right says, look, as an organization, you've got to demonstrate that you've implemented a robust risk management system, that you've got controls around your data. So you have good data governance, good data quality, you produce documentation, you do training, you provide transparency. All of these things are key to governance that Rob mentioned. So every organization will have to demonstrate that it does all of those things as soon as it builds what's deemed to be a high-risk system. And the Act lays out systems that are classified as high risk. And as part of the regime, there's going to be authorities that will assess organizations that actually, when they say they've done all the obligations, they really have done them. They've done them robustly. There'll be a way for that to be assessed. So I think just as GDPR some years ago launched, and really is a shining light for data privacy. I think the EU AI Act is following in a similar spirit. And as the first global act, I think it's going to be hugely impactful. The box on the bottom left, I'll just talk to, when we talk about general purpose AI, we're talking about ChatGPT, those kind of systems. So those transformer ones that are really large and really big. And there's some constraints listed there, whereby if you're a company that develops and creates those, and even if you deploy one, so a bank that deploys one of those, there's certain obligations that you must satisfy there around transparency. So they're taking this really, really seriously. And even 0.5, 10 to the power of 25 floating point operations per second. So they're actually being really technical. They're saying if your system computes this many calculations per second, it's a very large number, actually 10 to 25. It's 10 without 25 zeros on the end, isn't it? Then you're a general purpose AI system, and we're going to come down and enforce all of these obligations against you. And you're going to have to do those. So a hell of a lot to go into. But just as I guess the key takeaway is it's across industry sectors. So it's not saying that for banking, some things are high risk, for pharmaceuticals, others are, for manufacturing, other things are high risk. It's just categorizing things into prohibited high risk, medium risk, and low risk across all industry sectors at once. I'll pause there, Tony.
So yeah, no, clearly a pretty complete framework and quite prescriptive. And I think we already identified some overlap with consumer duty, which I think calls for identification and protection of vulnerable customers, for example. And then there's certain things prohibited here in the regulation. When we were talking about use cases a few minutes ago, I just wanted to unpack that a little bit in the context of ethical use cases, because I think that's really interesting. What's an ethical use case and what's not an ethical use case in the context of, just being responsible, and also clearly in the context of the regulation that's starting to come down the line as well. Perhaps we could talk about that in a minute, and then I'd like to follow that with what should firms actually be doing? You're a point ahead of AI ethics, which I think is the job that you had, Paul, before your current firm. But there's some practical things that institutions should be doing right now. So perhaps a couple of things we can do on this, and then we'll talk a bit about sustainability in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's on another slide, Tony, but let me just talk about things that an organization could do. So in my introduction, I mentioned people, process, and technology. And we can look at each of these in turn. So, for example, I fully support that large organizations, maybe not large, but organizations should have an ethics board or an ethics committee or a council. And it can be comprised of various individuals, but certainly individuals in a company that are really closely connected to their customers and have a good sense of what customers will find acceptable. And really, the purpose of that committee is to look at the way the company is using AI and make decisions as to whether it should or should not deploy a model for certain use cases. And I'm gonna give an example that's a bit prosaic, but it's there to illustrate the point. For a bank, should they, for example, in addition, when they give credit, when they make credit lending decisions, should they also look at their customers' Facebook profiles, or their social media accounts, to try and get a feel for the characteristics of that person? There's a lot of people that go, "Oh no, that's ridiculous. You wouldn't want to do that." But there are other people that say, "Well, actually, existing tech users, credit score people, actually don't take account of certain things. So, for example, if you just moved to the UK, you don't have a credit history. But why should you be denied a loan just because there isn't a credit history? It doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad risk. It just means that there isn't a credit history about you." So there are certain cases like that, a few cases actually, where an existing system is actually biased already, and you could argue, therefore, could you do something to improve on that situation and pull in data from different sources to help make better decisions? But of course, you introduce new problems when you do that, as you would clearly do in this sort of case. But a decision to do that, you can imagine an ethics committee would debate whether or not it's the right thing to do, and what is the impact of their customers, and is there a risk of reputational harm if the firm was to do it? And Tony, that kind of decision making is a discussion. You don't build a system to make that decision. You move away from building systems. You actually discuss the values of the company, the customers' expectations, what's appropriate, what's right, how discrimination can be mitigated. So it's really a discussion about values. When we talk about ethics, it's about values and principles. They're very, very hard to put into an algorithm. So you have to discuss them. And the ethics committees I've been on, unfortunately, there's never a case where everyone walks out happy. That's the nature of ethics.
I mean, I love that example. Is it ethical to scrape social media to underwrite a loan or to credit score someone? And I wonder how many firms have got ahead of AI ethics or an ethics committee. I feel that's quite progressive from the conversations that we've been having. Rob, anything to add on the governance and ethics side from your perspective in terms of sort of practical playbook steps?
I genuinely think it's about making sure that you design for it from the get-go. So as soon as you take a decision that there is some form of AI going to be involved in a process, you've got to start thinking about the the governance and the fairness and the ethics of that from the very beginning. There's no use trying to sort of back end load it. To Paul's point, you need a group of people who can talk this stuff through, who understand the ethical implications of what you're doing, and then can sort of translate that into reality and make sure, and then effectively hold the organization to make sure that it's delivering against that ethical underpinning, that ethical requirement. And that's really difficult, because one of the things that we know about AI, and it's a little bit like what was going on with cyber, if you go back, say, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you looked into the big organizations in the city and you said, well, who knows anything about cyber risk? Nobody. Who knows anything about cyber risk at board level? Definitely nobody. And gradually what's happened over time is that level of expertise has grown and people have moved into roles, and then now you have non-executives who have that level of expertise. I mean, Paul, you tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it feels to me from the interactions I've had that we're still at the sort of beginning of that curve, particularly at the sort of senior executive, non-exec level of institutions, where there's a bit of work to do, I think, to get the level of expertise into the organization at the top of the shop, as it were, to mean that you can have those meaningful conversations around these things.
Yeah, totally, Robin. And I'm really not talking about that space here, right?
No.
But just generally, this technology is really new. And some of these risks are really hard to identify, right? So you really do need people who have a good understanding, not only of the business, but also of the tech at the same time, and able to really effectively communicate that to a senior audience that may not have those skills. So there aren't that many people around that can have those conversations and be able to really advise and steer. Now, clearly, over time, as you're right, as more investment goes into this area, there will be more specialists, and it will be like security, where we'll see more of them. At the moment, there's not enough people, I think. It's encouraging, however, that there are a lot of organisations now investing in training not only their workforce, but insisting on hiring a head of responsible AI to talk to the board and to talk to different people in organisations. And that does bring me to another point, actually. You raised a really good point, Bob. I didn't talk about it earlier. Identifying ethical issues early on. Right? There's no point in building a system that took 12 months to build it. Just before you deploy, you go to the ethics board and say, well, we're going to do this. Is it okay? And the ethics board go, well, no. So identifying ethical issues really early on in a model development lifecycle, so you don't waste investment, is really important. And we do that as well. So we have people trained in responsible AI and ethics that are data scientists, machine learning engineers. We have diversity in development teams. So people from different backgrounds, people with different perspectives, because bias can creep in when you're not really conscious of it. And I think diversity, and not just diversity of ethnicity, but diversity of thought, is actually really, really important. And having an ethics committee come in really early when a system is being developed, even at the conception stage, get the committee to think about it at that point, I think can pay dividends, and I really encourage that.
Yeah, so identify ethical cases, design for ethics and governance from the very beginning. It's really interesting about that education point. I know several large financial institutions, one in particular, who've sort of got a big call out to the senior execs to go build their AI strategies. But it's often the same strata that, this education is inconsistent, if I'm at best, perhaps. And, doing something as pivotal as an AI strategy top down without necessarily understanding the building blocks and having had that grounding is an interesting ask, right?
Yeah, no, really tough. And actually, this is one of the things that I'm so chuffed about now.
Yeah.
As head of responsible AI and the AI strategy, what we're doing is we're putting responsible AI at the center and at the foundational level. And so it's throughout our strategy.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy to be in that fortunate position.
Thank you. So look, for those who are, we're getting a few questions on this. We are going to leave some time for questions. I'm now looking at the clock. So we'll do perhaps 5 minutes on sustainable AI. So lots of sector focus on sustainability and on ESG, lots of focus on AI. Now, sustainable AI, sort of what is that and what do we need to be thinking about? So let's talk about that for a few minutes, and then we'll try and leave 10 minutes to come back and answer some of the questions that we're getting from the audience.
Sure, Tony. Yeah, okay, thank you. So just on this, some people in the audience may well be aware, but generative AI, the way it computes and the way it runs, it's hugely compute intensive. Like the underlying architecture transforms to something called neural networks. There's a huge amount of these floating point operations with the matrix multiplications, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of billions of these. And it's now quite well documented that actually the energy demand, data center cooling, so the demand on water, and the cost of running these models is going to be absolutely huge, much more than we've seen for just other technologies. So here's an example here. So if you look at just search, before Google used generative AI in its search, its old search algorithm, right, was so much more efficient to do search. Search using ChatGPT, right, its energy cost is 1,000 times more expensive than older technology to do search. And in terms of compute, which is, I mentioned before, the floating point operations, is 10 to 100 times more expensive. And there are schools of thought out there that say, look, generative AI, like, it's just not sustainable. There is no way that people that build these models, which is your OpenAIs, your Anthropics, are actually going to be able to be successful operations that can survive, because actually they're just being underwritten by venture capital firms, by other big technology companies, and they're completely losing money. And there doesn't really seem to be an easy way out. So that's on the cost side. And on the energy side, maybe people in the audience will have heard that Google, Microsoft, and Amazon have all recently bought nuclear-powered reactors. Two of those companies in Pennsylvania, because they've recognized the US electricity grid infrastructure will not support their demands for electricity to run AI. So clearly we're talking a multi-billion-dollar investment in alternative energy sources. So I think we have to be really, really careful about the risks from that.
Those stats are quite startling. So the hyperscaler AI companies have bought nuclear reactors. An AI search is 1,000 times more expensive than a Google search. I mean, okay. So look, let's talk about what a sustainable AI model might look like. And again, Paul, I think this is sort of partly your patch. So if you want to spend a couple of minutes on this.
Just a couple of minutes for the present time. I would say. So really, if we look at the bottom half of the circle, responsible AI, and when I use the word responsible AI, it's exactly ethical AI. Right? I like the word responsible AI because it's basically saying the message to people that we as an organization are responsible. Right? Ethics is dubious, ethics has conflicting views, but what we like to say is, as a head of responsible AI, I'm taking ownership to ensure that my systems behave well. So the bottom half of the circle is really what ethics has been about. It's about ethical compliance with laws, with principles, and making sure your model is accurate. And there is a trade-off between fairness and accuracy. That's the graph on the bottom right. It's a very well documented, very well known trade-off. But balancing that trade-off has typically been what ethics has been about, right? It's been really difficult to maintain accuracy of the model and fairness, remove bias, and all of these things. We've historically been battling with that in traditional predictive AI. And then along comes ChatGPT and generative AI. And really, in my mind, that's what's triggered me to talk about the top half of the circle as well. So what I'm saying there is, when we talk about sustainable AI, it should include the bottom half, which is everything we did for ethics and safety. But we now need to look at making our models energy efficient, making them sustainable, looking at the environmental impacts, the carbon and the greenhouse gas emissions from the data centers that are powered by these huge models, and also look at how we can make models more efficient. So compute efficiencies in the top left. I won't be able to talk about it in detail, but there are techniques for that. So really what I'm trying to say, Tony, is that, look, ethics has kind of grown from what we traditionally looked at. It should now encompass some of the things. And there are trade-offs across all four segments of that circle. And we're just finding out what those trade-offs look like. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to use generative AI at scale, we can't go and we have to pay attention to greenhouse gas emissions. We can't just put the best model out there because it's energy intensive, it's a drain on water, it's potentially carbon emitting, but we have to be accurate, we have to be ethical compliant as well. So, you can't put the most powerful model out there and just use it, whenever you want to. You might get a really accurate answer, but actually might not be very sustainable for the environment.
Yeah. Look, I think you and Rob are going to be very busy going forward. This is such a big topic. We started talking about use cases, and then we said, what's an ethical use case? And then we started talking about governance and regulation. And now there's the alignment between the sustainability agenda and all of that. This is it's a really big space and so important. And I know you've got another picture, which is really sort of sustainable AI during the Gen AI life cycle. My takeaway on this is that this is about optimization on the prompt and the training data and the resources that are used by the AI models. And I know in the solutioning that we've done with our consulting team on some document AI use cases, there's a big difference between giving the universe of perhaps a policy library versus giving 3 or 4 policies into the AI model in order to get the answer that you're seeking. And so there's a very practical optimization that needs to be built in putting these systems together. Paul, do you want to comment on this one, or should we just keep moving? Because I think we've got a couple of other points, and I think we've got about to 10 questions on the chat, so we want to try and get through some of that. Let's keep moving. So what's the next steps? So sustainable AI, I'll jump to Rob because you've had a rest for a few minutes, but the regulators, strengthening compliance and providing the right incentives for model developers. What's the legal angle on sustainable AI?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the trade-offs that Paul was talking about. So if you go to let's say you run off to the FCA and say, well, look, what we're going to do is we're in the name of sustainability, we're going to compromise accuracy and fairness. The FCA will quite rightly say, well, where does that fit with your consumer duty implementation, and how do we manage that? And so for me, actually, this regulator piece is all about the language that you use to describe what you're doing, the way that you approach them to talk about what's happening, and how you're proposing to integrate that into your processes and the governance that you've gone through. But some of it is recognizing, and it's a point I was going to make earlier, that when Paul was talking about the fact that we haven't yet got a massive expertise in across the industry in AI, neither of the regulators, right? They have got a bit of a job to do to get themselves up that curve, but they have also got the overlay of we can't afford to have anything blow up on our watch. And that drives a lot of caution in their approach to these things if you're not careful. And so it's really about making sure with regulators that you get your ducks in a row early, and that you go to them with a proposal that is worked out, but also use language that they can engage with. And some of that will be non-technical language, right? And then you'll get to the technical language later on. But when you're describing to your supervision team, if you're lucky enough to have one, what you're trying to achieve, going straight into the technical end of it isn't going to be really helpful. You've got to put it in words that they understand. And just one other thought, if you're dual regulated, like Paul's firm is, like many other firms are, remember that the PRA and the FCA use different language for things because they have different objectives. So different words trigger different reactions for those two regulators. And so you've really got to think a bit about that comms piece. Sounds odd, but you've got to think about that comms piece quite carefully when you're talking to regulators about what you want to do.
It's such an interesting point, and I know that value add lawyering, if I can put it that way, is not all about drafting, interpreting, and representing. It's also about that communication point. I know quite a lot of what CMS does is actually helping clients become sort of regulator ready and engage early in the right way, in the right language, and the right frameworks for a positive outcome with their interaction with the regulator. I'm going to just skip forward because we're going to time out otherwise. There's a nice picture here on responsible AI, sort of end to end. And someone asked whether we're going to share the deck. We will share the deck with all the participants. So this is, consciously, these are busy slides. There's a lot to take away. But as I said at the top of the meeting, I think it's useful frameworks. So we'll share it. And I'll thank the panel for all of the inputs and the overviews to this point. But one thing I wanted to just call out before we go to Q&A is that Next Wave are running an exercise in Q1 next year. So we're going to be running an AI survey across the financial institutions, mid and scale market, and we're going to start with the banks, and we're going to be doing a reach out and an interview process. If you want to take part in it, we'll put a form in the thank you email, so you can just say I want to take part. It will be an hour of your time, and you do get the report in return for your inputs. So we're going to be talking about strategy, operating models, risk and compliance, and it should be very, very interesting, I think. So would very much invite the audience, any of you who want to take part and receive the research on the back of it, please let us know. Right, Q&A. I'm gonna, I don't really know where to start because we've got quite a few, but I'm going to start at the top because one or two people were on the front foot with asking questions early. So we've got a question about how organizations are aligning automated decisioning with the demands of UK GDPR. So I guess that's one for you, Rob.
Yeah, so just as a very, very quick answer to this, obviously UK GDPR basically says that if you're affecting people's rights by automated decision making, you can't do it unless you manage to avail yourself of a gateway. The answer really to this is to be found in the gateways that sit in the articles. And it's Article 21 that establishes the prohibition, Article 22 that establishes the gateways. So you've got to be really, really careful to make sure that you can articulate a way through the gateways if you're moving to fully automated decision making. Now, remember, this is fully automated with no human in the loop, effectively decision making. So if the decision is being made at the end with a human being taking an actual decision, you're likely, this is not really particularly my area in terms of GDPR, but you're likely to be outside that prohibition. So you just have to be really careful that you articulate what you're doing and how you're doing it very, very clearly, so that you can articulate where the decision is made and where the human is in the loop, if indeed there is one.
Thank you, Rob. And I'm going to cherry pick a couple of things here. And I'll ask this one to Paul. What would you advise C-suite and leadership who've deep concerns about the risks surrounding AI versus the associated risk of being left behind in the competitive AI-driven market? And if you look at the, just to add my twist on this, if you look at what Gartner and the analysts are saying, by 25, 26, they're saying you're either a firm with AI or you're a firm who's not on that journey, and you're going to get left behind. And by the way, the experimentation timeline is 12 to 18 months, so you need to be on the train now and fail fast and learn from all of that, and really calibrate your organization to be an AI-powered business. So that's a bit of a dilemma, isn't it? So Paul, thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it is a dilemma, right? There's the fear of missing out, the FOMO. Other organizations are investing heavily, so we should as well. And of course, consultancies and lots of other forecasters will tell you you should. But I think yes, you should, but cautiously. It's just really cautiously. If we look at the web, when the web was launched in about 2000, we really see the massive benefits of it that came many, many years later. Right? There were various phases in that evolution of that sector where firms came and went, technologies were tried, they didn't succeed. So I think when you're old like me, you've been through that. The benefit of hindsight allows you to think, well, look, I think we're in a similar moment, and I think we have quite a long journey to go. So building expertise within your technology function, building expertise in your organization board level is really important. It should be done first. And then work with generative AI on use cases that are low risk. So building something in a back office operations function where there's already an existing system and you want to maybe build a system next to it, or a kind of a co-pilot use. Microsoft Office Copilot is out there; it's pretty good, but you can constrain how that's used by your employees. But that needs a strong program of culture and awareness and comms to say how you should use it. And I think learn from that and build your AI strategy in a way that's done deliberately, carefully, without fear of missing out. I'll just leave that.
Yeah, very good. I think we got time for a couple. How can you ensure that financial institutions ensure that their AI systems are aligned with customer interests and not just profit-driven outcomes? I might ask Rob that. I mean, we've shared some really great insights on consumer duty. This is about customer interests and not just profit.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I mean, that's what the consumer duty is all about, right? So you should have, hopefully, please, everybody by now has got all of their consumer duty processes in place, and they're thinking about the things like value and consumer understanding and all those sorts of things. It's vital, absolutely vital. If you've got something in an AI system that touches and concerns or affects consumer outcomes, that you understand fully how the consumer duty requirements and how those aims and objectives of the consumer duty are being affected by the process that you're embarking on. And that includes things like price and value as well, right? So, there's an archetype in the industry that price and value means the cheaper the better. Actually, doesn't necessarily mean the cheaper the better. It's that you've got to go through the process of thinking about what price is and what value is in the context of the consumers that you have and the products that you deploy. And so when you're thinking about how AI slots into that, you've really got to touch each of those areas that the consumer duty requires you to touch and do the analysis. There's no short circuit for that, unfortunately, from the regulator's perspective.
Okay, thank you. So no shortcuts, and very much a plea to all firms to ensure that all of their consumer duty policies and protocols are all in place. So we've hit the top of the hour, so I think we're going to time out on this. We do have a view on, there are a number of great questions here. There's a view on these things. If you've asked something and you would like a follow up on that, Paul, Rob, very easy to find on LinkedIn, as am I, or respond. We'll send a thank you email and just respond to that if you want to be put in touch with any of the panelists. I know they'd be happy to chat and share perspectives. We're going to send the deck round, and I really hope this has been a useful session. I feel like we sort of unpacked it and there was more to talk about than we had time. But a big thank you to our panelists for some really deep insight there. And thank you to the audience for staying with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.